4 minutes after 10 is the time, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we will begin, I think, still. I'm not going to do this necessarily indefinitely, but I'll do it for as long as feels fitting. Still good news. 21 million COVID jabs now on British soil. The Daily Mail chooses to stick this on its front page, perfectly understandably. I don't think that any body really needs to have it explained to them why they would not put yesterday's death toll on the front page. The worst day of the pandemic so far yesterday, with 1,564 lives lost. 1,564. Oh boy. But the vaccine programme is still going extremely well. So once again, just because they muffed everything up yesterday doesn't mean that they will muff everything up today. And so far, so splendid with the vaccines. I am worried, and so should you be, I think, about this new strain that has been discovered in Brazil. I don't know whether it was intentional, but there was a caller yesterday. It was Jane in Finchley. It was Jane, wasn't it? I hope I haven't misremembered her name. She's always so charming when she comes on the programme. And she sort of just snuck under my radar a bit. You may have noticed I have a terrible habit of speaking before I finish listening, or interrupting, as some people like to call it. And it means that sometimes conversations I've had sort of land after they've finished. And I think back on the programme most days when we're done. And Jane said something about being worried. She was sort of moderating my enthusiasm or my positivity, my optimism regarding vaccines, and I think slightly challenging that old line about they muffed everything up yesterday doesn't mean they'll muff everything up today. And she just said if a new strain, if a vaccine-resistant strain comes along, then, well, just think. Because as I realised last night when that death toll was published, this is now the direct consequence of the dithering, the denial and the delay that we saw in December. It's one for the alliteration fans out there, I think. But it really is. I don't think there can be any doubt about that. Boris Johnson was describing the idea of keeping families apart at Christmas as inhuman, right up until the point that he changed his advice, his guidance, and suggested that families should keep apart at Christmas. It's incredible to see the a Grand Old Day doesn't feel heavy enough, does it? It doesn't feel a profound enough description of what we're seeing. It's surreal, the failure to learn from what went wrong before, and most obviously, you could make a joke about, well, he's learnt not to faff about when Marcus Rashford flicks his fingers, hasn't he? He's learnt to jump to it immediately, instead of spending the first time round a couple of days pretending not to know who Marcus Rashford was, or not to know that Marcus Rashford had intervened on the first school meals fiasco. I think that U-turn took 48 hours, the second one took 24, and the third one took 10 minutes. So he's learnt from that, to give the fella credit. When Marcus Rashford calls, Boris Johnson now drops everything and does whatever it is that Marcus Rashford wants, which very simply is feeding hungry children, the goddamn communist. But on other areas, on the really big areas, if you were trying to work out why the death toll was so high, then yesterday, today, this week, now, then December is the answer, isn't it? Late December is the answer. Christmas is the answer. And even in December, he was dithering, denying and delaying. It's actually heartbreaking, but we do not, what's the word? Do not, like, well, professionally speaking, I don't know how to report it anymore. I don't know how to do it, because it's just true. And yet, if we've learned anything from events in America over the last 4 years, being simply true is no longer enough. Being simply true is no longer enough. And that is why I think we'll start today with events in America. President Trump has become impeached, or has been impeached, for a second time. 10 Republicans joining in the vote to do so. I mean, I know you're thinking only 10, but remember, it's a public vote. Had it been a secret ballot, I suspect the number would have been far higher. And perhaps one of the most resonant comments I heard came from, I think it was Rick Wilson, who was heavily involved in the Lincoln Project. And he was talking about a senior a Republican lawmaker saying, of course, he would want to vote to impeach Donald Trump, but if he did so, he'd be worried about his family being killed by the kind of people that stormed the Capitol last week. And I don't know that I could look that fella in the eye and call him a coward for not voting in the way that he knew he should vote, and for voting instead at the behest of the mob. And the mob remain the most conclusive imaginable proof of what happens when objective truth is undermined, when the very pinnacle of power in any society elects to lie and lie and lie again, which is, of course, what Donald Trump has done. Now, some people still, I mean, the only way now that you can claim Donald Trump is not a liar is to claim that children are being abducted and their blood being harvested to feed the elixirs of youth consumed by people like Bill Gates, Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks. That's the only way now you can cling on to the idea. He lied when he talked about votes being stolen. He launched ludicrous legal actions that culminated in Rudy Giuliani standing in the car park of a garden centre, claiming that votes had been stolen and failing to provide a single scintilla of evidence. It's so complete now. What's the word you want? The corruption. So complete, this corruption, that a significant percentage of Republican voters still don't think he's done anything wrong, which means they think that votes were stolen, which means they have successfully been persuaded to ignore the evidence of their eyes and ears. It would be impossible to listen to Donald Trump's words since the election result became clear, and most obviously on the actual day of the insurrection, and not see his deliberate, calculated incitement of those actions. I mean, at one point he was telling me he was going to come with them to the Capitol, and then of course he jumped in his limousine instead and went back to the White House. This is a man that actually deployed law enforcement officers to clear peaceful protesters with tear gas so he could stand on the steps of a church he'd never been in and wave a Bible around while claiming to be Christian. And still the support is sustained. I guess doing this for a living, if there's a silver lining to having to chronicle the corruption so completely, the silver lining is that it robs you of shock. It robs you of the capacity to be surprised by the depravity, because the depravity has been so complete. Whether it begins with the birth certificate lies that him and his wife told, or whether it begins with the mockery of disability, or the lampooning of war heroes. I mean, the confessing to say, I mean, the list. At one point, about a couple of years ago, I could do it in my sleep. I could rattle off that list of utterly depraved behaviours without even pausing to think or draw breath. It was like a litany. And it was all true. And yet still, what was once confined to the darkest corners of the sort of troll-infested parts of the internet came kicking and screaming into the light, into the public, into the mainstream. And it did so for one reason and one reason only. It did so because Donald Trump wanted it to. It became his only path to salvation, and the desperation to cling on to power, I think, is best understood as a desperation not to be scrutinised, not to... I mean, Deutsche Bank's got him on the hook for about, is it $400 million? They've announced they're never going to do business with him again. Anyway, the desperation to cling on to power is because it is the only path that provides him with a possible escape route from responsibility for his own actions. And yet, even as I speak to you, I am conscious of the fact that some people listening to this programme will still be shouting at clouds, or shouting at me, or claiming some other interpretation of events. It's the strangest thing when truth dies. And it doesn't die with a bang, it dies with a whimper. And those of us who are trying to alert everybody else to how important it is or how big a deal this is, we carry heavy burdens. I don't get your violins out. But imagine what it's like to know that if there were ever a British equivalent of what we saw in Washington, D.C. last week, imagine what it's like to know that you would be one of the people that ignorant, hate-filled mob had been primed to hate the most. It's quite a chilling thought, actually, and one which in many ways I wish I'd never had. But, you know, that is almost like the embodiment of internet hatred. It's when it moves from virtual to actual, and instead of people just bombarding you with lies and abuse on social media. These people haven't, and I'm thinking more of politicians than pundits, but the politicians who routinely come in for this sort of abuse, your Diane Abbotts, I think, most obviously, they saw last week what happens when that bile, that deliberately cultivated hatred, that furious ignorance, they saw last week what happens when it moves away. People like Diane Abbott already know, of course, because of various criminal cases and her own post bag. But they saw what it looks like when it moves out of the darkest corners of the internet and moves into the middle of the town square. So I return with no apologies to the question that has haunted me since Donald Trump first emerged as a major presidential contender. What does he offer people? The question becomes more urgent every time I ask it. I know he's finished now, he's gone, but Trumpism, the corruption of truth, the corruption of observable reality, that doesn't disappear with Trump. Millions and millions of people still believe the lies he tells them. And I don't understand it. I've never understood it. You know, my theory is that it all comes down to racism, white supremacism, call it what you will, but that's not a very reassuring thought, even if it turns out to be true. It's the opposite of reassuring, actually, because it makes you realise how easy it is to sign up these people. Give them a little bit of licence to bring their racism back to the surface, and they will let you do anything to them and with them. So, I'll take any answer at all on this, but I really want to. Well, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I just want you to be honest with me. And the question I would like you to answer is, even now, as his corruption is complete, his utter corruption is complete and obvious, even for those of us for whom it was obvious from the start, can sit down and wind our necks in a bit. All right, it took people a while to see what we saw from the start. That's fine, no, there's no prizes for prescience. But I still don't know what he offered them. Do you? 0345 6060973. What did Trump offer to these people that allowed them to abandon reality and the most basic requirements of civilization? What was it? What was in the credit column? I still don't know. 0345 6060973. And I'll take any answer you've got, especially actually today. If you think there's a sensible or honest answer to that question and actually what he offered, if you liked him, if you fell for it and you're adamant that it had nothing whatsoever to do with all the abuse of Muslims and Mexicans and migrants, what was it? Hit the numbers now. You know the rest.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. LBC with James O'Brien.
It's 20 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Other things that we may have a look at today include the 71% of working mothers who've been refused furlough by their employers when they said they needed it for childcare reasons, and the continuing chaos for fishermen. And, well, I just say fishermen, brackets and women, but I think we all know what fishermen means. If only someone had suggested or perhaps even predicted this, it would be great, wouldn't it? And there was a fisheries minister before a committee yesterday who appeared to be suggesting that she hadn't managed to properly get her head around the fishing elements of the deal that Boris Johnson unveiled on Christmas Eve because she was too busy organising her local nativity trail. I'm all for nativity trails, but if you're the fisheries minister and changes to the status quo that are going to wreak havoc upon the industry that you represent are published, I would have thought you could have left the baby in the manger and focused on the finer detail of what was going to happen to the industry you are nominally in charge of. But hey-ho, I'm quite old-fashioned like that. 21 after 10 is the time. What did Donald Trump offer people? Because I mean, the great curse of the liberal is that you always want to think the best of people, and it actually sits very uncomfortably with me to conclude that all he offered was a licence to be racist again. That is my view, for the avoidance of doubt, but I would genuinely like your help in changing it. Mark's in Bilderston in Suffolk. Mark, what do you reckon?
Hello, mate. I think I think there's a parallel with Brexit. There are lots of people. I remember one guy being interviewed just after Brexit. He was 57 and he'd never voted.
Right.
So he finally got something. Bloody hell! There's something for me here.
What though?
It was the racist element, I think, in his particular case.
Okay.
And I think, although America is a fantastic
Brexit
country,
wasn't in and of itself a racist project, of course. I would struggle to say the same thing about Donald Trump.
Of course not, but it did attract
yes.
a group of people. And I think what's interesting about the Trump thing is populist politicians, for me anyway, they follow the mob. They don't lead as such. And I think as he weakens, as Trump weakens, he knows the mob will stop following him and maybe they'll look for someone else. So he has to maintain that ridiculous situation.
Some of these people, one of these people, I don't know if you saw him, the one that was dressed a little bit like JK out of Jamiroquai and is currently in jail, insisting that they serve him organic food. There's no one snowflakes like an anti-snowflake, do they? But
Seems that way, yeah.
He's in his 30s. He works as an actor or a voiceover artist. He's not what you would necessarily think of if someone were to describe a knuckle-dragging bigot to you. I don't know that it is racism that excites him. It's something else, and that's what I want to get to. What does he get out of supporting Trump?
I think there's a kind of, it's the equivalent of Jeremy Corbyn whipping up the Labour supporters to invade Parliament, isn't it?
I'll tell you what, you're winning friends and influencing people today. You castigated Brexit and you've castigated Jeremy Corbyn supporters. Are you auditioning for my holiday cover, Mark? What's going on?
No, right. But the thing is, it's like we are used to. I'm 61. I'm not a kid. We're used to Britain having and America having a framework.
Yes, exactly.
Within which these people behave. It's like a giant climbing frame.
Yes.
And the politicians have to be inside that frame. And if they step outside, they get booted out. Basically, there's a scandal and off they go. But what's happening is people are starting to, construct their own.
But I guess what you do is you see it as transactional, and that may be our mistake because, as you say, perhaps we're held hostage by that framework. We cannot imagine life outside it, which is why I can't get inside the heads of people who were desperate to break out of it. But I see it as transactional, so I will look the other way. I will close my eyes and ears, or even further, I will believe things via cognitive dissonance that I simultaneously know not to be true, because in return for jumping on the Trump train, I get what?
God, it's a really hard one to answer. I wish I had a simple answer. Americans, I was married to an American, so I know a little bit about them. And culturally, they're different to us anyway, because they speak English, but that's one of the only similarities. They are very different in the way they look at things. There's more guns than Americans. If they decided they were going to cause trouble, they really, really could. And this is where we're getting into dangerous territory.
And that's what they're worried about now,
because
isn't it?
It looks as though, allegedly there might be policemen or even members of Congress involved in frameworks that allow people to do things they wouldn't otherwise have been able to do.
There's some deeply dodgy stories emerging, but
they're really whether they. Hopefully we'll get to see, because what we want here is clarity. But it's just that.
Well, we're never going to get it. We've already got the absence of clarity with him inciting them to riot, and some people already will go, "No, he didn't. He never incited them to riot. He just did." It's not even a debate, of course. But that's the problem. Is that already facilitators or deniers or whatever you want to call them will be trying to turn it into yet another both sides debate. Did he really incite them? No, it's not a debate. He did. He literally did. He's on tape doing it, and then he did the opposite. He claimed he wanted them all to calm down. And then he let it be known that he regretted issuing the video in which he claimed that he didn't want it to happen and that he disapproved of it. Some very clever White House reporting doing the rounds, talking about how he was marching around the White House getting angry and confused about the fact that his aides didn't feel as positive about the scenes unfolding on. His own vice president was anyway. Let's go to America. Mark's in Santa Monica. Mark, what do you think?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Well, I think, I was saying to your producer, the bottom half of the market, as it were, I think is taken care of by the sort of a la Brexit vote, the take back control. But I think the really overlooked part here is the sort of insidious upper end of things. Because, in both situations, by Trump sort of completely flattening and disrupting, allowed a lot of people to move in, people like Peter Thiel, who was a very large Facebook, board member, investor and board member. People like that, people forget he was a supporter of Trump. He's not an idiot.
So what was in it for him then? Just commercial?
This libertarian idealism of we will now reshape the top because he's not going to do anything to affect the economy.
So this would be the American equivalent of the sort of Tufton Street Spectator magazine cabal, I think.
Well, yeah, I think so, absolutely. Because if you look at the way that the 1% have been treated under Trump, I mean that doesn't play out with his, support on the ground at all. And I think you've got a lot of people who were quite happy for Trump to kind of continue doing what he was doing, so they could, use the situation to their own ends.
So they didn't care about little people. I mean, they try and portray it as a sort of working class revolt by the economically frustrated or the left behind. But actually, you mentioned the 1%. It's not even the 1%, is it, Mark? It's the 0.0001%, and they own an awful lot. I mean, didn't Rebecca Mercer set up Parley, that app that for people who found Twitter too civilized and friendly and warm, so they had to set up their own. I mean, she set it up.
We saw how quickly that crumbled, though.
Yes, only after Trump crumbled. I think we're in danger of forgetting how easily he could have won. But there's something there, isn't there? Because we've got and another Brexit parallel is all of these incredibly privileged, posh, insulated people claiming that opposition to Brexit was elite or metropolitan elite. I mean, it would be hilarious if it hadn't worked so effectively. But they are a bigger answer to the question than the...
Indeed, and I think there was no better example of that. I remember listening to Neil Ferguson talk after Davos last year.
Yes.
Saying that, he saw these sort of people that were there to worship at the altar of Greta Thunberg.
Yes.
But all secretly inside, they were just hoping to God that Donald Trump got re-elected so their finances would be in order by the end of the year. Good. And I think it is slightly cynical, but I think that does have a lot to answer for it, especially in the American mindset of we're the greatest.
And we're back to that thing that if you don't live it, you can't understand it. And I don't want to use pejorative terms, but I'm tempted to. If you're never going to have enough, if you're part of that plutocrat class where you're already among the richest people in the world, but you think you won't be happy until your yacht's 6 foot bigger than the fella next door, then the rest of us can't get inside that mindset, and yet it probably drives much of the world's problems.
As I said, that's. I don't want to vilify all billionaires.
Nor do I. No, nor do I at all. But I do want to vilify the ones who've never got enough.
Yes, absolutely. Well, not just the ones who've never got enough, but the ones who think they can then wield their money for power. I mean, that's why Thiel is a great example. The man who single-handedly took down Gawker as well, by the way.
Yes, that's right. And of course that's why people like Bill Gates and George Soros, and to a lesser extent Warren Buffett, get so massively vilified, because they demonstrate that you can be a huge billionaire, you can be one of the richest people on the planet, and you can use your money for good, which is, of course, kryptonite to the kind of billionaires who would rather cut off their own arm than use their money for good. Simplistic. I've got to go. It's an incredible quality phone line. I think Mark used FaceTime audio, this is what the future sounds like. All the way from Santa Monica. It sounds like he's sitting next to me in the studio. It's 10:31. Holly Harris is here with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
10:36 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where it's a question I've asked you many times before, and it maybe there isn't an answer. Maybe you have to feel it. You can never actually understand it in the intellectual sense. When Trump said, and again, it's not that long ago I could reel this stuff off without even pausing to think, presuming so naively that if I kept putting it in front of you, and obviously very, very small cog in very, very big wheels of media and politics, but slightly bigger cog than I used to be before Trump and Brexit came along. And on both of those issues, I just presume that if you keep putting the facts in front of people, eventually everyone will agree on the facts. So, to stay with Brexit, the Mail runs a big piece today claiming that there's some sort of petty vendetta involved in British trucks, or the drivers of trucks that have left Britain having their food confiscated at the Dutch border, and the writer claims they don't treat Switzerland like this. And that's now. It's all done and dusted. It's over. It's sayonara, European Union. But they're still writing bilge, because Switzerland, as you know, because I've told you, is in the single market. It's even in the Schengen area. And as Kieran, who crosses that border regularly, has told us, when the customs offices are shut, the trucks can't cross the border. So, the denial of reality is complete. Now, oddly, with sovereignty, even though we've surrendered what could be described as practical sovereignty, we have increased what could be described as theoretical sovereignty. So I think these people are bonkers, but I can understand where they're coming from, and I think there's some exceptionalism involved in that theoretical sovereignty. But it doesn't actually have to be jingoism or racism. I'd say it was more anachronism. It was more not really understanding modernity, which is forgivable. There's stuff about modernity I don't understand, like Instagram. But with Trump, when he said I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose a single vote, what was it he understood that day that still eludes the rest of us? And I thought Mark was brilliant, because one of the greatest coups pulled off by the far right, I'm afraid I have to say, in recent years, has been to hire chalk-striped characters and public school educated demagogues to claim that they represent the working classes. And that was a stroke of genius. And when you double down on it, you end up accusing people who think that the average member of the public is clever. You end up accusing them of thinking that the average member of the public is stupid. That's just genius. Dominic Raab did it to me on this radio station. Suggested that I think all people who voted for Brexit are stupid or racist, when I've written books about why I don't and why it's so important to stress that. But the truth doesn't matter to these people, and I'm afraid I do put the current Foreign Secretary in that category. The truth doesn't matter to these people. All that matters is, well, what? So even in Raab's case, you can see he never really understood what European Union membership represented, and he bought into some sort of Ladybird book style notion of nationhood, which is, at least it's comprehensible. So what do you get out of supporting this ludicrous programme? Well, a sort of theoretical grasp of sovereignty that allows me to continue to pretend that we're living in the 1950s or something. I get it. What do Trump fans get out of supporting Trump? Even as thousands of them descend upon the Capitol wearing Auschwitz T-shirts and trumpeting their beliefs in the QAnon conspiracy, which, if you'd explained it to me 2, 3, 4 years ago, I'd have laughed in your face. I don't know. John is in Kettering. John, sorry to keep you. What is it? What's in the box, John?
What's in the box? Very, very good question. So, for Donald Trump, I think the biggest thing that he was able to sell was emotion more than anything else. So, I mean, America is a very patriotic country. I think we all know that. And, his big slogan...
What do we... Sorry to jump on you already, because patriotic is such a broad church, isn't it? What you mean, I think, is America, more than many other countries, believes that being American makes you somehow superior to other nations.
Well, yes, they are the mighty America, aren't they? That's what they think of themselves, absolutely.
Which is fine.
Think about his slogan, "Make America Great Again." So that you can make you thinking, well, why aren't we great? Yes, we should be great.
Yes.
So he's managing to get that, and then he's managing to get them thinking, well, how can we get there? So, America was at the height of its greatness in inverted commas when they went to the moon. Oh, we'll go back to the moon. I'm sure he said something like that at some point, didn't he?
He did talk about space a lot, actually. Good point.
And then, we'll build build a wall so that, we can keep this greatness inside, and so with all of the stuff which we don't like, we can keep out. And he never built that wall, did he? So,
how dare you?
So yeah, I think that's my main point. Is that
the first lie is the lie about history, and it may not even be a lie, because I don't think anybody's going to get cross with me for suggesting that Donald Trump probably doesn't know a lot about history, or indeed anything, except somehow how to manipulate credulous people. But so the first lie is this glorious past, because I mean, you mentioned the moon landings. Is that 1969?
Yep.
So that's, 6 years before the Vietnam War ended. So America was tearing itself to shreds over the Vietnam War. So there was no glorious heyday. And it's very Brexity, that. I'm sorry to bring the B word into it again, but that's so Brexity, because it's a non-existent past. Right. It's like this Faragey-flavoured notion of Britain, which just never, ever existed. Mm.
No, you're right, and Brexit was driven on emotion as well.
Yes, how dare you?
A similar sort of thing. So he promised the wall, we promised to control our borders.
Yeah.
Without
stopping to think. So with Make America Great Again, it would be, and there was a CNN reporter who did this brilliantly, and I think a Daily Show reporter did it as well, where you would just go up to people at the rallies, put a microphone in front of them and say, when was America great? When did it stop being great? They can't really tell you. And then with control our borders, if you just leave that unchallenged, because, of course, the minute you point out you can only ever control one side of a border, the whole thing falls apart. I wish I'd spotted that one sooner, but goodness me, we're going to discover it the hard way in the coming months and years. So we're back to the slogans. But so that's more... That's a warmer analysis than the pure racism one. It's a myth. It's a myth of recoverable history.
Sort of, yeah. I think there's an element of racism in there. I mean, particularly for some people in parts of the country. So, and that's on both sides of the pond, for us and for them.
Well, then that becomes when did we lose our greatness? Well, when we started letting all these foreigners live here. The people who write about how you can't be British if you're not white, or there are too many brown faces in the supermarket. No. So that, I mean, unless we can think of something else, that was probably it, wasn't it? So it is just another facet of the racism.
Well, I think the border thing, from our point of view, was just one of the things that they played the emotion on. I think they played the emotion on the NHS as well. I think we're very proud of our NHS as a country. I mean, I saw a poll, I think it was towards the end of last year, where most British people would be happy to pay a bit more for the NHS to make it better.
Yes.
And I'm one of those people. I think the NHS is a wonderful thing, and to actually slap on the side of a bus with that £350 million that we give to the EU every week, let's give that to the NHS. That it's not a fact. It's just pure emotion, because they know that we love the NHS and we want to see it do well.
But what was the Trump equivalent of that, though? I want to steer proceedings. I know what you're going. I mean, if I could say this out loud, all bets are off. But let's not talk about Brexit at this point in proceedings. What was the Trump equivalent of the bus?
The Trump equivalent of that? I mean,
just make America
he wanted
great
to do the opposite of that, actually.
I know he
did.
If
I remember correctly,
because
Obamacare was kind of their equivalent of our NHS.
That's another great example of people cheering to the rafters policies that will damage their lives.
Yeah, exactly. But they have a strong emotion against the socialism of healthcare, don't they?
Yes.
I mean, when Obamacare was coming in. Let's say, forgive me, I don't know a huge amount about Obamacare and how it compares to the system we have here, but it is a more socialist sort of example compared to what they currently have.
Socialised.
Yeah.
I mean, even I worry about the way socialist has been misused and demonised, but it's socialised healthcare. So it's like it's like insurance. Everybody pays in according to how much they have, and everybody takes out according to how much they need. And these Tufton Street / Spectator / Mercer / I don't know, Breitbart, these ghouls, that's what they really hate most of all. Yeah. How can you and me have the same access to services that a billionaire over there has? And why am I paying tax to help poor children go to school or get fed?
it's just rubbish. It really is. But again, it played on the emotion of it. So Trump wanted to go through that, and there was something on the Fox News which I saw when all this Obamacare was going through, and they costed it up to be about $2 trillion or something like that. And they called it sick. They called it a fantasy, and that there's no way that this sort of thing could actually happen. But what they didn't tell you was that the amount of money that they spend on the privatized healthcare system was 2.3 trillion.
And the bankruptcies that go along with the people who've even paid for health insurance when things get really messy for them. I know it's simplistic, but I think that's huge. That resentment of the idea of sharing. That's all it is. It's why I talked to Mark earlier about the people who will never have enough. So again, yeah, I think you're onto something there, John. That idea that he told them something had been taken away from them, and he promised to give it back. And as long as you don't dig too deeply or ask too many questions, that's an incredibly powerful offer, I think. I like the way we framed the question, though, when John came on. That's the first time we've done it that way. Here it is. You support Donald Trump. Here's your present. It's in the box. OK, open the box, lads. Tell me what's inside on 0345 6060 973.
Leading Britain's conversation. LBC with James O'Brien.
10:52 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. They just don't get it. They just don't get it. You just don't get it. You're damn right I don't get it. What is it that you get in return for turning off your most basic faculties and supporting Donald Trump? So the very, very rich people that made him happen, that's easy. They want to... You think back to totalitarian regimes of the past, and or even fascist regimes of the past, and you forget, because history is written by the winners, you forget how many people did very well under those systems. You forget that families and dynastic structures replaced any vague semblance of meritocracy. We sit here somewhat naively, and remember, we've had fascist dictatorships quite close to home. We've had them in Spain and Greece in living memory. Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, is it's a short hop, skip and a jump away. The idea that these things couldn't happen here is one of the things I've waved goodbye to over the last few years. But you forget that people do well out of these regimes. They get the contracts, they get the money, they get the impunity, they get the free pass. But it's the people that go along with it. It's the people that fall into line. It is, to coin a phrase I use a lot, it's the forelock tuggers and the cap doffers. Reading a lot about Ireland at the moment, because I might move there. But I'm reading some fiction, actually, but it paints a beautiful picture of deference. I mean, beautiful as in how powerful it is. It's a horrible thing. But Ireland, of course, was colonised by the Brits. And it's hard for me as an Anglo-Irishman who's never lived there. It's hard for me to understand that mindset. But, of course, it gets reflected in England. So there is a plausibility. The author, Tana French, her name is, she suggests, and she's an American who lives in Dublin, writes the most magnificent thrillers, but also, when a thriller transcends genre, becomes literary. She writes beautifully about Ireland, with perhaps an acuity that only an outsider could enjoy, an outsider becoming an insider. And she talks about how a posh accent and a certain demeanour for sort of 1950s Ireland would be the same as a qualification or a certificate. You just think, well, if they talk like that, they must be trustworthy. And you look at Jacob Rees-Mogg, of course, is the most obvious example, because the way he talks is so contrived and fake. You see that it works here. And Jacob Rees-Mogg talks utter twaddle. Utter, provable twaddle. But he talks it in a way that makes many, many people here in Britain think, oh, well, yes, exactly, he's right. As long as you don't stop to think. And that's part of the Trump appeal, as long as you don't stop to think. Of course, in America, it would be wealth as opposed to breeding, both of which you can fake. One of the examples I just used has got fake breeding, and the other has got fake wealth. But those are the things that make, well, he must be trustworthy. But what's in the box? What is in the box? Matthew's in Addleston in Surrey. Matthew, what's in the box?
James, I think it's nostalgia. I think that Donald Trump offers a dream of a time when America was great, was preeminent, perhaps not since the 50s, and when China and India weren't economic rivals in the global scale, when they did have a position of supremacy as a superpower, could fight two wars at any one time.
They won the Cold War. I mean, there are books that have been written and there are books that will be written, but I don't think don't at me on challenging that. They won the Cold War,
of course. Fukuyama wrote The End of History, and it didn't quite go that way. He's kind of...
I'm John Sweeney, host of a new podcast series, Hunting Chilene. It's a fairy story in reverse of how the beautiful daughter of a multi-millionaire faces decades in prison. Ghislaine Maxwell denies providing underage girls for the mega-rich paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. But will her powerful friends help now the eyes of the world are upon her? Hunting Ghislaine. Listen now on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts.
Perhaps that now, that actually, that never happened. But just that, America started to lose some of its global dominance economically and militarily, and that advantage and privilege was taken for granted, and I think that chimes with some of his supporters. That's all I can come up with, James.
No, it's
That's
brilliant.
All I can come up with.
It's brilliant because, of course, the other thing it does, and I'm trying to negotiate these observations in a at least divisive way as possible. But I'm charged with describing people I am not like and do not fully understand. But the more of your personal identity is tied up in your nationality, the more seductive that offer of making us like we used to be becomes. Because it's never going to win my vote, telling me that we're going to make the country more powerful again. I want you to tell me how you're going to feed hungry children, or put talented people in prominent jobs instead of people who were born in the right place at the right time. But if a huge part of your personal identity is tied up in the accident of your birth, then this is a massive offer for you.
Absolutely, James.
Yeah, you've got it. I think that's a huge part of it, and I hope that doesn't sound, because I appreciate lots and lots of people whose personal identity is tied up in the accident of their birth are not the demons or the deplorables of popular conversation. But of course, then you're back to the Dominic Raab type lies about people like me. So people like James, they think you're racist, they think you're thick. Spend my life proving that I don't, but it doesn't matter, because I suppose if you want to believe that the accident of your birth is special, makes you different, then you have to believe that people who point out how silly that is think that you're stupid and racist. Instead of people who point out that how silly that is think that your own life would improve if you could abandon that prejudice. If you actually started to see yourself and other people's value according to what they do in life, as opposed to the accident of their birth, then not only does the world become a happier, safer place, but you become a happier, safer person. But if you rely upon the votes of unhappy, frightened, angry people for your project, whether it's winning power or whether it's getting Brexit over the line, if you rely upon the votes of unhappy, angry people, you have to keep them unhappy and angry. That seems to me to be quite straightforward. So who's going to challenge the thesis that Donald Trump is very good at making people unhappy, frightened and angry? Because I'm afraid you're going to need a very long run up to win that argument with me. It's pretty much what he's best at. You make people unhappy, frightened and angry. And then you promise to fix these unspecified problems caused by Muslims or Mexicans or migrants or liberals or the radical left. Meaningless phrase, doesn't matter. There's an enemy. They're coming to get you. I will protect you. What's in the box? Absolutely nothing. Nothing at all is in the box. But what were those people doing in Washington last week? They were marching in support of the man who promised to protect them from a non-existent enemy. Good grief. Might do a couple more questions on what's in the box. 0345 606 0973. But we will also be moving on. I'd quite like to talk about fish. No, I'm not joking. It's 11 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC. This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 11 is the time. We are continuing with this conversation because we've got a little bit of business to attend to at 11:45. And then, of course, Mystery Hour comes at 12. And as every bulletin keeps reminding you, we are in uncharted waters. 2 impeachments for one president, for a one-term president, no less. I mean, it is absolutely incredible and genuine fear in Trump's mind that senators may turn on him when he is put on trial in the Senate. Because he got away with the last impeachment after he had threatened to withdraw aid from a foreign country unless they launched an investigation into the son of his presidential rival. He was guilty as sin, but of course the problem with putting people on trial in parliaments is that long before I coined the phrase footballification, I think it's fair to say that if you put a president from one party on trial in a chamber populated by both parties, then everybody from the president's party is going to vote to defend the president. I think that's tragic and awful and wrong, but I suspect it would be true if the roles were reversed, depending, of course, on what the offence is. You have to hope, I think, you have to cling even to the notion that eventually these people will do something so heinous, so egregious, that the scales fall away from the eyes of even the most committed and delusional supporter. But Trump, of course, understood that that may not be true when he said the thing about shooting someone on Fifth Avenue. He was effectively saying there is nothing that will stop these people supporting me, which makes the failure of people like me, and possibly you, to understand what the appeal is all the more urgent, all the more fascinating, I hope. You know, he stands up in front of a room full of supporters and effectively says, you lot are so dumb that even if I shot one of you, the rest of you would still love me. And they go, yay, 4 more years. And then you think it's an insult to me to say you just don't get it? You're damn right I don't get it. There's a man standing in front of you explaining why you have been so completely corrupted and gaslit and manipulated. He could shoot one of you right now, and the rest of you would still cheer him. Genuinely breathtaking. Andy's in Hackney. Andy, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, my point is that he hasn't so much posed a question as appealed to animal instincts.
Carry on.
In that, humanists sort of tell us that we're, incredibly intelligent. We're so sharp. We're so good at this, that, and the other. But in the end, we're just animals. And Trump, Steve Bannon, probably more to the point, they're very good at appealing to those instincts.
Is it atavism, which is reverting to something ancient or ancestral?
Primal,
primitivism, primalism.
Mm.
But then you're a whinging liberal describing these people as Neanderthals.
No.
I'm telling you what would happen. I don't think you are.
We all have it.
Right.
We all have it. It's the herd mentality. We all follow certain paths, and if somebody appeals to, a section of society that feel that they're neglected in some way, then they're going to follow, somebody like Trump.
Okay, then. Where does QAnon fit into that analysis?
That is just crazy.
Yeah.
But that's social media.
Yeah, but we've all got social media.
Everything.
We haven't all ended up believing the absolute bilge that QAnon conspirators profess to believe.
No. But then you're talking to somebody that closed his Facebook account 12 years ago. So, social media for me is just, it's poisoned everything.
we got the Holocaust without social media, Andy. I mean, I'm slightly wary of some of the conversations springing up around social media.
Yeah, but this is where the animal behaviour thing comes in, because there have been swings to the right, and this kind of behaviour has happened through history, hasn't it? You know, again, it's this sort of cycle of behaviour that we have.
So you need that primal instinct because of real danger. You see.
Well, this is it.
So if you can activate
or perceived danger,
bingo. But you can't have one without the other. So you need. It's a bit like that whipping up patriotism to send people to die in a war that they don't really understand, because we march under this flag and we hate everybody else that doesn't. You need that because wars happen. But if you're going to whip it up for other reasons, you open up a Pandora's box of problems. This primal reaction, lizard brain, it's been called. Jack Reacher Lee Child's Jack Reacher books are brilliant on the lizard brain. But you need to have the lizard brain in order to deal with real dangers. But a brilliant manipulator of people will be able to activate the lizard brain in response to unreal or non-existent dangers. And there is Donald Trump in what is close to a nutshell.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. Is that I think for us to progress as a species, I don't want to get, I realise I'm looking at a wide sort of, scale of things here. But the thing is that we have to realise that actually we're not as clever as we think we are.
Oh, we're not as advanced as we think we are. Clever's probably not quite the right word, if you'd allow.
Well, yeah,
it's more sophisticated.
Maybe.
We're not as sophisticated as we think we are, and the veneer of sophistication. And again, this is something that I think you're right to remind us everyone should recognise. The veneer of sophistication is quite easily removed.
Exactly. If we can accept that, then we actually have a basis to make, to actually progress from. Because at the moment we seem to think that we've got too much. Well, we believe that we've got a lot sussed out.
Yes.
When we don't.
And maybe
because we keep making the same mistakes again and again and again. I mean, it's only 75 years ago, which is nothing in the grand scale of things.
Blink of an eye.
That this happened before, isn't it?
And do you think possibly, because you mentioned cleverness, that might be a different horse in the same race? Because people who really don't understand things, or people who fear perhaps that they don't understand things but aren't quite bright enough to realise how little they understand, they are the people most terrified by education or expertise or knowledge or understanding or whatever you want to call it. And the slogan becomes a sort of shield against your own ignorance. You might feel stupid, but if you just shout "Make America Great Again" a bit louder, or just shout "Control our borders" a bit louder, the louder you shout it, the less stupid you feel.
Well, that's where the herd mentality comes in again, because again, you look at every species on planet Earth, basically, and what other species commits genocide, wipes out various other species, and destroys the climate.
And then expends enormous amounts of effort and energy on persuading people that they're not actually destroying the climate, because the people expending the enormous amounts of efforts and energy are making such a ton of money out of it. I like it, Andy, and no, you don't apologise for reaching for complicated answers to questions. Emma goes further. She says QAnon is the new iteration of Ikean thought, secret exclusive information, inflating self-importance and encouraging tribalism. It's modern Mithraism. I don't know how much responsibility Trump bears for the QAnon conspiracy. He seemed to me to get into bed with it quite late in the game, but it's fair to say that it was built upon support for Trump, even if he didn't build it himself. 12 minutes after 11 is the time. Daniel's in Hanover in Germany. Daniel, what's in the box?
I moved to Seattle from London in 2009, and moving to Seattle is basically the liberal mothership.
I've been there. I know my sister used to work in Seattle. I know it quite well.
So I lived there, and I lived there for 6 years before moving to Detroit, the Midwest, which is completely the opposite. So living in Seattle and living amongst more educated people and a more international crowd, you can understand their thinking and the acceptance of immigrants and all that kind of thing.
Right.
But then moving to the Midwest, I suddenly became aware of how uneducated people are about their own country. I mean, luckily for me, when I moved to Seattle, I went to the state capitol in Washington, and in the state of Washington, and I actually sat down with someone in the Government Information Center and learned about how bills become law, Congress, everything. It was great. People just, I mean, when
so
I
that's the fear. I can make you frightened of something that you shouldn't be frightened of. I mean, look what Paul Dacre's editorship of the Daily Mail achieved over so many. Everyone's terrified of their own shadow. But, of course, the people who live in the metropolitan hubbubs, the people who are living in cosmopolitan cities and towns, they are the least frightened people by the threat of diversity or immigration or multiculturalism or whatever you want to call it. The terrified people are the people who live millions of miles away from it and spend their lives on what used to be the Daily Mail's comment section.
Yeah, well, I also became aware. I mean, the people in the US have been told for decades that they should hate government and government's bad.
Yes,
and then
that's
you've
true.
got all these people running for government because they want to get in there so they can take all the wealth for themselves and their buddies.
Yes.
But the other issue is, and I hate to blame Fox News because it's an easy out, but I mean, I talk to customers who I respect and I thought was smart. And I spoke to one recently, and we don't really talk politics, but they were telling me Trump had done the best out of anyone with coronavirus. And I don't know where this comes from. Well,
it's got to be social media, hasn't it? It's got to be.
Well, if you watch Fox News for 10 minutes, you'll soon come to the conclusion that these people...
No, of course, Fox News and social media, but even Fox News has stepped back a little bit from the most mad of claims. The idea that the worst country in the world is the best country in the world is quite incredible, isn't it? I mean, genuinely incredible. And this is when they say, I don't know if you ever get this in Hanoi, when they say, you just don't get it, do you? You kind of want to say, you're damn right I don't get it. You believe that the world leader who's handled this crisis worse than any other has handled it better than any other. I will never get it, I don't think.
I don't. And the other thing is, talking to my colleagues who are 99% Trump supporters, when I decided to move to Germany, they instantly they were like, "Oh, the taxes are horrendous in Germany," and I'm like, "Yeah, but how much is your healthcare premiums per year?" I mean, I was paying $10,000 a year in healthcare premiums before I moved to Germany, and yes, I'm paying a bit more tax now, but I get a lot more bang for my buck.
And yesterday I was reading about what unemployment benefit is in the UK compared to other European countries, and the percentage of the wage you were on when you lost your job compared to the income that you get on unemployment support, and you're on the right side of that divide, aren't you?
I believe so.
I hope you never have to find out, Daniel.
No.
But before you go, I'm a student of accents. I'm picking up West Bromwich.
Oh, wow. I was born in Sandwell Hospital in West Bromwich. I can't believe you picked that out. I grew up in Wensbury, which is...
I know Wensbury. Of course it is.
Jeremy Clarkson called Wensbury the worst place on earth, which, it's not far wrong, actually, but
it's only, you can't say that if you're an outsider. You can only say that if you're an insider. It's family, isn't it?
I moved to London in 2001, and then I was there for 7 or 8 years before moving to Seattle, but...
you can take the boy. You can take the boy out of West Brom, Daniel, but I'm not sure you can ever take the West Brom out of the boy. He shoots, he scores. 11:17.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. LBC with James O'Brien.
20 minutes after 11 is the time, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I am incorrigible, one of my most tireless Twitter correspondents, has hit the archives to demonstrate that Fox News didn't just endanger its viewers by systematically downplaying COVID-19, they misled people into dangerous and reckless behaviour. And it's another element of Trumpism that I just don't understand. Why does it go hand in hand with coronavirus denial or coronavirus scepticism? What's that link? I tell you what, for a fellow who spends an awful lot of his time patting himself on the back for understanding everything, I'm picking on a lot of topics today where my understanding is zilch, zero. What is the attraction of Donald Trump? Unless it really is just racism, which in many ways is even more depressing than not understanding it at all. Or coupled with that primal, I thought that was a very good contribution, this idea that you need to have a lizard brain in order to deal with real threats. You know, it's why you jump, isn't it? Like a leaf gets blown across the path in front of you and you jump because you thought it might be a rat. Well, why would you jump if it was a rat? Well, because rats carry disease. So there's some sort of evolutionary inheritance that makes you fear vermin or disease carriers. That's maybe not the best example, but you know, when the hairs prick up on the back of your neck, it's a thing, and it's a good thing, and it's equipped as well, which is why it survived various stages of evolution. But if you can master the art of making the hairs prick up on the back of somebody's neck when there isn't a threat, if you can master the art of activating the lizard brain for no reason other than harvesting the support of the owner of the lizard brain, then not only does that support become real, but it also perhaps becomes another example of switching off your eyes and ears. I don't know. And I still don't know why that Venn diagram exists between what you'd call skepticism, if you were being kind about lockdowns and coronavirus, or what you'd call homicidal ignorance, if you were being a little bit less kind, and support for Trump, to a lesser extent Brexit. It's a weird one, isn't it? I guess it's about the prioritisation of evidence or fact over feeling. But then that offends everybody who sits on the other side of the fence on those three issues, because you probably don't think of yourself as somebody who prioritises feelings over facts, which is why I open up my phone lines to you and ask what was in the box. Reese is in Haifa in Israel. Reese, what do you think?
Hi, James. How are you?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
Just the first thing I'd like to say, my mum is your greatest admirer, and she sends her regards.
Fantastic. What's her name?
Leslie.
Leslie, you're a woman of impeccable taste, and you've clearly done a cracking job raising Reese as well. Now, where were we?
She'll be glad. Yeah. Anyway, what's in the box? You know, it's fascinating, and I mean, to dare I say it in a judgmental way, to rational people.
Yes.
This has been an insane phenomenon. It doesn't make any sense. But at one point, I just got tired of being so judgmental, and I started to pry into it. And it seems that there are two, relatively speaking, rational explanations behind some of the reasons that Trump was voted. And the first thing is that people on the right in America, Republicans, many of them have this built-in fear of government intervention, which leads to this feeling, and this basically got worse during Obama's administration, yes, of feeling that politicians are corrupted or easily corruptible. That politicians can be bought. And suddenly comes this person who is not a politician, who is a billionaire, who, because he's a billionaire and cannot be bought, gave these people this feeling of security of, oh my God, this is someone who cannot be bought. He cannot be corrupted. So at least we can go with that. And this this really kind of it really keyed into this fear.
But he was more for sale than anybody else. But of course, it's all about perception, not reality. Isn't
absolutely.
It?
I mean, obviously, saying that Trump is not corrupt is absolutely insane. But it doesn't matter. What matters is how they saw it, and they saw this person who, by the way, it's not just about him being a billionaire. It's the fact that he did not come from politics.
Yes.
The fact that he did not have enough political experience or no political experience to be corrupted by these institutions, the deep state and all this nonsense. So that's the first thing. And the second thing...
Yeah, and that's got nothing to do with racism, has it?
That specifically doesn't, but the next thing is somewhat related, and that is, as you know, over the past decade or so, there's been a lot of illegal immigration coming in from Mexico, and this led to a lot of people losing their jobs in many states. But I think the majority of them were states that usually vote right, usually red states. And the thing is that people, because of PC culture and because of this sensitivity, people on the right and on the left, politicians that is, were afraid of addressing this issue, because any time someone would address the issue of, like, people's jobs being taken away by illegal immigrants, they were immediately categorized as racist. and this applied to both Democrats and
But
Republicans.
is that? I mean, as I understood it, the Mexican immigration, particularly illegal Mexican immigration, would be sort of what you describe as service sector work, and the collapse in the American dream was a lot more to do with production and facilities and factories going to much cheaper parts of the world.
Yeah, like China, for example.
Yeah,
absolutely.
but the Middle East and actually South America as well. You know, big car plants moving to South America. I see. I have huge problems with that analysis because I think that most of the people encouraging ordinary folk to blame their lack of advancement on immigration, whether legal or illegal, I think they are racist.
No, but that's the point. You're probably right. But however, as you said with my previous point, it's a question of how they perceived it.
Yes, of course it is.
And not what is actually the truth, sadly. That's the sad thing about it.
Yeah.
And nothing can change the fact that many people in America, whether it was justified or not.
But I don't think illegal Mexican immigration has had I don't know, actually. You've looked into it more than I have. I need to find out more. I don't know that it's had a massive or measurable impact upon the legal employment of American-born people. I don't know.
But either way, they felt that way, whether it's true or not. And suddenly came Trump, who addressed this issue, and they were like, "Oh my God, someone's addressing this. Someone is actually talking about this." And the fact that he spoke in a bigoted, racist way did not particularly interest them. By the way, many people who supported him were appalled by his rhetoric. But they said, at the very least, he's addressing this.
Right.
And, on the other hand, you have Hillary, who said in 2016 that they're going to put the coal miners out of work, which is unbelievably insensitive.
Yes.
And suddenly people are saying, yes, Trump is bigoted and he's probably racist and his rhetoric is appalling. But what he's saying is he's addressing things that bother us, and at the very least we have that. And these are two, again, it's all relatively speaking, rational explanations more than just saying, bigotry, racism, and so on.
Yes, of course.
Which
and then it becomes, for liberals, for want of a better word perhaps, then it becomes a question of a confusion over how people can hold their noses when the stench is so...
Yes. That's what's been baffling me over these past 4 years. It's unbelievable.
Finally, Reece, because we're going to hit the news, quite a lot of support for him, certainly the way once it had been filtered through the lens of British media, quite a lot of support for him in Israel. Is that a different phenomenon?
What was the question again, sorry?
There's quite a lot of support for Trump in Israel, which for people just tuning in is where you're calling from. It's a weird question just to drop into the mix if you'd phone me up from Stoke Newington. But is that a different analysis of support, or do the same general truths hold?
You mean the reason there's support for Trump in Israel?
Yes.
Well, Trump has been very good for Israel, I must say.
Yes.
Very, very good for Israel. He's been very kind. He's been forthcoming. He also, ironically, thanks to him, we have 4 peace deals with countries that were previously hostile.
These are things that you could put in the credit column, albeit that the wooing, as I understand it, of the hardcore Christian evangelicals and the moving of embassies and things like that is because they believe there's going to be a second coming.
Oh yeah, that's people in Israel are don't really key into this evangelical belief, but it's the fact that Trump has been good to Israel that creates a lot of support. Obviously there's also a lot of the bigotry involved, but a lot of the bigotry that Trump addresses is Israel has its own bigotries, which Trump does not address because he's on the other side of the world.
Yes.
But it's
yes, and if you're just looking in the window, then that these are attractive products from an Israeli point of view that he has put onto the stage, into the shop. That was a great call. Again, one of those days where I'm getting almost as many messages about how good my callers are as I am getting messages addressing the issues that we're talking about, and Reece is a shining example of exactly that. 11:30 is the time. Holly Harris is here now with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Thanks to NHS Talking Therapies, this week we're looking at mental health, and I caught up with Paul Edwards earlier to hear how therapy has helped him. Paul, thanks for your time. Just begin, if you would, by telling me what it was that made you seek some sort of help.
Yeah, unfortunately, fortunately, I was a detective in the police for many years, and back in 2009, I undertook a worldwide paedophile investigation, and part of that meant reviewing a lot of material once the offender had appealed his sentence in the Royal Court of Justice. So that was back in 2009. Luckily, my boss realised I'd got some problems, so I needed some help. But as the man that I was and the detective, although I took part in some therapy supplied by the police, I was never probably honest with myself, let alone the psychologist, and just became in a circle of a hamster wheel of recovery and then not recovering, and just spending my whole life just having to concentrate on keeping my job in the police. Yeah. So 2016, unfortunately, it was apparent that I could no longer do my job. So I was medically retired from the police, which triggered yet another breakdown. Unfortunately, the way that the NHS had gone, then I didn't think that I could find any help, and the police, unfortunately, weren't in a position to help me. So I was very fortunate that I researched the internet and came up with my local IAC service. So yeah, that was where my life changed in a different way, having reached out to them.
And just give us an idea of what that talking therapy is like, if you would. I mean, is it as simple as just having somebody to listen to you say things that perhaps you would struggle even to say to yourself in a quiet moment?
It's twofold, James. It's admitting it to yourself, which is the greatest thing. But then I always called it having a chat rather than talking therapist, because I found my psychologist, she was fantastic. She made it as if we were just having a chat all the time. But what she'd do is she'd give me some tools for my toolbox, as I call them now, not realising actually that I was having them. And I'd changed the focus of trying to make my day more livable. So I was given tools from my toolbox, which meant me going away and doing a lot of homework. And that's the biggest thing. They give you the tools, but it's very much your own work that can get you better and help you recover, because very much like running a marathon, you can't just go and run a marathon. You have to sort of train individually, and your mind needs that for me. So yeah, I was given a number of tools and homework to do, and go back and talk about how it was doing, and climb a couple of rungs up the ladder and fall down one, but not truly go back to base, which was, the way I saw it, which was a more positive outlook for a lot of things that I was struggling with. But yeah, kind of giving me a base and a reason to sort of live again.
Were you surprised, Paul? Because I imagine, and I think you've alluded to it obliquely, that the culture of the police service is obviously pretty macho. I know it's not as it was when you joined, but it's still a fair description, I think. So were you surprised to feel it working?
I think that when I was in the police, I saw two psychologists who were superb. But obviously, for me, I wasn't in the position that, I was fully honest with myself. So, I was concentrating on my police work. Once I retired, the daily subjectivity to the trauma that I was having was no longer there. So, although I had a massive breakdown after then and probably was at the lowest point of my life at that point, I wasn't subjected to the police machoism, the police banter, sort of
freed you in a way. Then
it did free me, but I had to be honest with myself first. And it gave me that ability to take the tools that I was given and very luckily, and got to work and as you know yourself, James, it's that hard work yourself that you have to put in. But with the fantastic guidance of those people from the talking therapists, that they have your route planned out for you, where you've started, and your goals that you'd like to achieve. And as we all know, every route sort of doesn't always end and start and end up in the way that you thought. So
it's funny.
Yeah, it's very fortunate to be able to go from.
It is, isn't it? It's a mixture of luck and circumstance. I can hear my own psychotherapist's words in the background while you're talking, Paul, because she always said to me, when the student is ready, the teacher appears, and you clearly had to get to a place to be amenable, open to the kind of work that your therapist helped you do. When did you realise it was working? What was like a moment where you sort of thought, crikey, I'm really making progress here. I'm really improving. These tools are working.
I guess when I found my relationship with my wife and my children again, that I'd subjected them to years and years of my illness, and not being able to understand it again, and understanding, I guess, when my triggers were going to be set off, and having that understanding that my triggers were coming up before they actually came. We used a technique with my wife where she would understand me better than I would, and could see when my triggers were coming up. And we used to have a code, and she used to say to me, "Oh, do you want some chewing gum?" And that made me think and stop about what was happening, and what had maybe triggered me to the point that I was going to transgress into the other side. And I guess it was the point where she said to me, "Do you want some chewing gum?" And I thought there was something wrong, and she actually just meant that I needed to clean my teeth, maybe.
It's probably fair to say, I hope it hasn't been too stressful for you, but lockdown and other COVID-related issues will have, as we know, contributed to many people's struggles with mental health. What advice would you give to people listening to this now who may think that they have a mental health concern, but haven't yet taken any efforts to address it?
Somebody said to me, James, the other week, and I'm lucky to talk to the new students who are qualifying to be CBT therapists at university. And somebody said to me, "Oh, we're all in the same boat." To which I answered, "No, we're not all in the same boat. We're all weathering the same storm. Some of us are lucky enough to have ocean liners. Some of us are lucky enough to have boats that float. Other of us have a lilo, and actually others aren't actually on the sea in the first place." But what I would say is reach out. The talking therapist is there. It's a fantastic opportunity to talk, either self-referral or through your GP. But it's having that faith in that. Yeah, IAPT is there for you, and so are a number of other fantastic talking therapists. But please use them, because I was lucky enough to volunteer back at my IAPT service, and I took part in group therapy as part of co-production of the courses. But I always sat within that course with those people, because I'm still there on a daily basis. I still got the associated depression and anxiety, but I understand because I've walked through that door. And
I do.
I through the volunteering, I was very, very lucky to meet a lot of people who came for therapy and one-on-one, obviously pre-COVID. But I always tried to greet them in that way that I was greeted when I first was there, with a very welcoming, and I felt welcome. I call it smiley eyes, If they welcome you with smiley eyes, then they truly do care. And everybody's different. Everybody has to follow their own journey, but those tools that they can give you, whether it's just for depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, perinatal, they're very skilled practitioners, and you know, it does help. It really does. And you know,
I do. I should.
As you find yourself.
Well, I do indeed. It's hard to shut me up about it, actually, Paul. As you'll
I think we could talk. I think we could talk for hours, James.
Not wrong. I'll just add that IAPT, IAPT, as you've mentioned it a couple of times, stands for Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, and the bottom line is, as Paul has just explained beautifully, talking can help. It will help. If you're struggling with feelings of anxiety or depression or anything associated, then NHS talking therapies can help you. Just speak to your GP, or you can even refer yourself online at nhs.uk/talk. Paul, thank you, mate, and thank you to NHS Talking Therapies. For more information, go to lbc.co.uk.
Leading Britain's conversation, LBC, with James O'Brien.
10 minutes to 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and pre-recorded that interview that you just heard, as you could probably tell. So allow me just to say a couple of words as someone who has, to his own shock and surprise, benefited immeasurably from therapy. What breaks my heart the most, and my new book is mostly about this, but I mention that only by way of qualifications for what I'm about to say. I am, for once, not plugging it. Well, I suppose I am in a way, but still, that was not the top priority. I have this unshakable belief that the people who would benefit most from therapy are the people who are most sceptical about the benefits of therapy. And I really can say that to you because I was one of them. And it's why people like Paul, who you just heard from, a former police officer, I think are such powerful advocates. A brand new series, Trafficked, with Mariana Van Zeller, will be starting on Monday the 18th at 9 p.m. on the National Geographic Channel. It's an investigative look with unparalleled access to the underground and illicit world of smugglers. Mariana gains a unique level of backstage access, and the danger she puts herself in with each topical episode is incredible. In episode 1, Tigers, Mariana tackles what one of her sources calls the untouchable smuggling story. It's a black market for tigers and tiger parts that's so lucrative, so secretive, and so dangerous that few have attempted to uncover its ugly details. Mariana journeys far and near to meet these smugglers face to face. Brand new series Trafficked with Mariana Van Zeller starts on Monday the 18th of January at 9 p.m. on the National Geographic Channel. For psychotherapy, cognitive behavioural, any form of therapy really, any form of talking cure. Jakey's been in touch. Jakey is one of my longest serving listeners and also a firefighter, all 6'4" of him. And he talks about it being like a bucket that slowly fills up, sometimes over years. One day that bucket can just overflow uncontrollably. And he says, for me, it took 20 years for an incident to jump out from the shadows and become the dark dog that got me. Rescuers need rescuing too. What a beautiful line that is. And he talks of anxiety, depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. And it takes me up for saying if you are struggling for precisely the reason I've just highlighted, many frontline workers will let pride drag them down. It's better to say if you are feeling overwhelmed as opposed to if you are struggling. So I take that on board, always learning. It's always a pleasure to communicate with people who've walked down very different paths from the ones that we've walked down. Rescuers often find it very difficult to ask for help, he says. We help others. It's not about self. And Jakey's learned those lessons the hard way, but he's come out the other side. There's a doctor here, a health psychologist and therapist in the NHS, Sula, who said, so lovely to hear a huge shout out for IAPT psychological support services. As a proud psychologist, she says, also championing the fact that many services also support people with long-term conditions too. And I mean, in fact, I'd go as far as to say that the people who would benefit most from therapy are the people who would mock someone like me for extolling the virtues of therapy. Does that make sense? It's the buried bitterness. It's the survival personalities. It's people like me who've spent their entire lives wearing suits of armour, thinking it was our skin, not realising that there's another way. And a big wake-up call for me, retrospectively, is watching all of the sort of older figures in my profession biting chunks out of each other on Twitter every day. That is very much what happens when you can't turn off your fight or flight mode, when you live your whole life having to win everything and battle everyone. It's so exhausting and so horrible to see. And of course, those of us who were in that mindset are the ones that are most sceptical about the idea, A, of the mindset existing, or B, therapy providing a way out of it. Anyway, back to business. What's in the box that Donald Trump offered to people? And I should add, before we do that, my personal thanks to NHS Talking Heads for their involvement in this scheme. More on LBC for the rest of the week. Let's get back to the question of what's in the box. And then at 12 o'clock, if you're bored of me furiously plugging my book, How Not to Be Wrong, The Art of Changing Your Mind, I've got great news for you. Today is the day that I start furiously plugging the imminent Mystery Hour board game that will soon be available in shops near you. Jim is in Spalding to steer us back, if you can remember, Jim, to the question of what people who love Donald Trump, support Donald Trump, cheer Donald Trump, what do they get in return?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Just to say it's been a fascinating discussion up to now, and I'll just see if I can redress the balance on the calibre of your callers.
That's my job. Don't worry, Jim.
Yeah, well, the box is obviously empty. I think, you know, the more pertinent question is, what do Trump supporters think that's in the box? He's done a brilliant job of persuading them that he's draining the swamp by filling it with more alligators, in my view. And for me, Trump is just one of the factors in the story of how the USA has got, arrived at this current place.
Yes.
And, I think he's used his celebrity and he's used the demagogue playbook, and he's done a really good job of tapping into populism. I don't know if you read Matthew Goodwin's book on national populism. He's a political scientist. Really good book.
No, I think he wrote something untrue about me in a previous book, so I probably steered clear of. I think he did. If it's the fellow I'm thinking of.
Well, the amount of when I read a book is disappointing how little of it I actually absorb. But the bits that I did absorb was, he said that populism is always there in society. It just depends on whether the conditions are right for it to come to the surface.
Mm.
And, if you think about populism, Lenin was a populist, probably Blair and Corbyn were populists. It's not just the right wing. And, one of the things that he says is...
I don't know that Blair was a populist. I mean, for me, a populist is someone who tells lies in order to get an emotional response from the people who then become their followers.
I'd probably say that's more of a demagogue, but, it's tomatoes, really. But
yeah, so I wouldn't put Blair on that list. I'm not even sure I'd put Corbyn on that list personally. I think some of his following was populist or cultish, but I don't think he behaved in a way that created... I think he's it's too early now, but anyway, I'm splitting hairs, and I'm also unimpressed by your source material, but rely on your own thoughts rather than anybody else.
This call will get cut short. But
no, it won't. Of course it won't. Carry on.
Yeah, the point I was struggling to get to is, not all populists are fascists, but all fascists are populists.
Yes.
And one thing that Goodwin was saying when he wasn't obviously laying into you was that...
I hope I haven't got the wrong fella. I should apologise in advance if I have.
Matthew
But
Goodwin,
no one was laying into me. It was just... something to do with my interview with Farage a few years ago, and I think he asked to interview me and then just didn't turn up, and then still wrote about it in the book. But this is awful. I could be terribly maligning the wrong person. So let's not mention them again, and I'll apologise to every Matthew Goodwin on the planet. Yes, exactly that. I've probably misremembered. But briefly, if you would, this populism bandwagon, how do you tell... I mean, where does it take people? What do they get in return?
Well, I think... it's curing a level of dissatisfaction, and I think if you look at the States, it sort of rose to being an economic superpower with FDR in the 30s and throughout the war period in the 50s. And then you say, when did it finish? I think it finished when they lost their bogeyman at the end of the 80s. And so...
I'm not splitting hairs, I know it sounds like I am. The Soviet Union wasn't really a bogeyman. I mean, elements of its threat were very, very, very real, but the simplism of having it like the Rocky IV, was it, where it was a Russian... That symbolic symbolism was, they lost that when the Soviet Union collapsed. But oddly, Russia's back on that kind of scale, and they seem to grease Donald Trump's passage into the White House.
Yeah, but if you think about where his support is, you've obviously got a lot of support in the South, which is very historical. A lot of it probably going back to the Civil War. But then you're getting new support up in what they call the Rust Belt, which is where they used to build all the cars and produce all the coal and the steel. And that economic superiority has disappeared, and it's changed into...
And he promised to bring it back. So,
exactly.
I mean, that's denying... This is where they talk of nation states. It denies modernity, global reality, and most of all, I think it denies mobility, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Because if you can get your kit made more cheaply, as long as you're not deploying sweatshops, although of course they do that as well, you're going to move your plant away from the place inhabited by people who can afford to buy your product, and that weird conundrum breaks at some point, and Trump capitalized on the break and told people we can go back to the days where just doing a 9-to-5 job would deliver a lifestyle that is now out of your reach.
And I think where America had economic domination, Britain had the British Empire, and there's sort of
yes.
hankerings back
that fault nostalgia
exactly
and it's why people get so hugely furious when you point out simple historical truths about the British Empire. Jim, you played a blinder and you rounded things off, the cherry on the icing on the cake. And now it's time, after the very latest news headlines, it's time for Mystery Hour.